The rhythmic sound of boots striking the grass echoed through the empty training ground. Mohamed Salah exhaled, his muscles burning from the relentless drills. He thrived in these quiet moments, the hours when no cameras, no journalists, no distractions pulled him away from the game he loved. Football was his escape, his obsession, his sanctuary. Then his phone rang. At first, he ignored it. He always did during training, but the buzzing persisted, insistent, cutting through the air like an alarm. He jogged over to the bench, wiping sweat from his brow as he glanced at the screen. A name from his past. His fingers hesitated before answering. Kareem? The voice on the other end was tight, hesitant. Mo, I didn't know if I should call, but you needed to hear this. Salah straightened. Something about Kareem's tone sent a chill down his spine. What is it? A silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Then Kareem spoke. It's about Coach Hossam. Salah's grip on the phone tightened. He's not doing well, Mo. He's struggling. I heard he had to sell his old house. He's in a small apartment now, barely affording food. The club, no one from the Federation. Salah didn't hear the rest. His mind raced back to a dusty field in Nagrig, where a wiry young boy with oversized boots ran drills until his legs nearly gave out. He remembered the sharp voice of a man who had pushed him harder than anyone. Again, Mohammed, faster! One more time. A voice that had believed in him long before the world ever did. And now, that same man was forgotten? Salah blinked, his chest tightening. Where is he? His voice was quieter now, but there was an edge to it. A dangerous kind of calm. Kareem sighed. Still in Egypt. Same city, he never left. A pause. Moo. It's bad. Salah turned, staring at the empty goalpost ahead. Just an hour ago, football had been his only focus. Now it was the last thing on his mind. This wasn't just a call. It was a debt. A debt he had no intention of leaving unpaid. The past had a strange way of creeping in when you least expected it. As Mohamed Salah sat in the quiet of his hotel room that evening, Kareem's words echoed in his mind. He's struggling, Mo. It's bad. He closed his eyes and suddenly he wasn't in a five-star hotel suite anymore. He was back in Nagrig, a boy of 12, standing at the edge of a dirt field with torn boots and a heart too stubborn to quit. The air was thick with dust, the heat relentless, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was football and the man who had shaped his love for it. Coach Hossam stood in the center of the makeshift pitch, hands on his hips, his deep voice cutting through the dry air. Again, Mohammed, faster, don't stop now. Salah was exhausted, his legs trembling from hours of sprints and drills, but quitting was never an option. Not here. Not under Hossam's watch. The man had a way of seeing potential where others only saw limits. Champions don't get tired, Hossam barked. They keep running even when their legs beg them to stop. Salah had believed him. He had pushed, fought, willed himself to keep going, not realizing back then that these moments, these brutal, sweat-soaked afternoons, would one day define him. The boy in him still remembered the endless journeys, the cramped, sweltering bus rides, packed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, his bag of football gear clutched to his chest. The hours it took just to get to training and the even longer journey home. He remembered the nights he'd stumble into bed, body aching, but his dreams alive, burning brighter than ever. And always, there was Hossam, waiting for him the next day, pushing, teaching, believing. Now that same man was alone, forgotten, struggling. Salah's eyes snapped open. Without him, I wouldn't be here. The thought struck him hard, a truth he could never ignore. He owed everything to those days, to those lessons, to that man. And he wasn't about to let him fade into the past. Mohamed Salah wasn't the type to sit still when something weighed on his heart. The moment he ended the call with Kareem, he was already dialing another number, then another, and another. Each call brought him closer to the truth, but the truth wasn't what he wanted to hear. Coach Hossam had vanished from the world that once cheered his name. The man who had built generations of players, who had given everything to the game, was now just a whisper in the streets of Nagrig. A ghost of a legend. One of Salah's old teammates sighed heavily over the phone. Mo, it's not good. He lost everything. The club let him go years ago. No pension, no support, just forgotten. Salah gripped the phone tighter. And no one helped him? A pause. Then quietly, who was left to help? Salah's jaw clenched. Another call, another story. He tried opening a small training school, but it didn't last. No funding, no backing. Another. He was sick for a while. No money for a proper doctor. Another. He barely leaves his house, Mo. I don't think he wants people to see him like this. Salah felt something sharp twist in his chest. He had been in stadiums filled with thousands, lifted trophies in front of millions, celebrated by the world. Yet the man who once yelled at him to run faster, train harder, never give up, was now struggling to afford a meal. His fingers hovered over his phone screen. Then, without hesitation, he sent a message to his team. Find his address. I'm going home. He didn't care how, he didn't care when. He was going to see his coach. And he wasn't leaving without him. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, but Mohamed Salah barely noticed. His fingers gripped the armrest, his mind elsewhere. He had landed in Cairo countless times before, but this trip was different. No grand welcome, no flashing cameras, just him, a man on a mission. He pulled his hood over his head as he stepped off the plane, moving quickly through the airport, unnoticed. He didn't call for security. He didn't inform the press. He didn't want attention. He wanted answers. The city smelled the same. Spiced air, sun-baked concrete, the distant scent of grilled meat from roadside vendors. He barely glanced at the familiar streets as his driver navigated through them. This wasn't a visit for nostalgia. When they finally reached the outskirts of his hometown, the car slowed. Salah stared out the window at the roads he used to walk as a child, where he once chased a deflated ball with friends who dreamed just like he did. Then the car stopped. It was smaller than he imagined. The house in front of him was more of a shell than a home, its walls stained with time, its windows covered with old curtains that barely hung on. The kind of place that, if you didn't know better, you'd assume was abandoned. Salah swallowed hard. This was where Coach Hassam lived now? He stepped out of the car, pulling his hoodie lower over his face. A stray dog watched him from a distance. The street was silent except for the distant hum of life carrying on beyond this forgotten corner of the world. His heart pounded. He had faced Champions League finals, impossible defenders, the weight of a nation's expectations. But standing in front of this rusted metal door, he hesitated. For the first time in years, Mohamed Salah felt like a kid again, and he was about to meet the man who made him who he was. He took a breath and knocked. The knock echoed through the still air, sharp against the silence. Salah stepped back, his breath slow, steady, at least on the outside. Inside, his chest was tight, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had no idea what to expect, no idea what he would see when that door opened. Seconds stretched. Then the doorknob rattled. A creak. A pause. And then the door opened. The man standing in the doorway was not the one Salah remembered. The once towering figure, the coach with the booming voice and fierce presence, had been replaced by someone smaller, thinner, worn by time. Hassam's shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship. His eyes, once filled with fire, held only exhaustion. At first he just stared. No words, no movement, just silence. Salah felt his throat tighten. "Coach," he whispered. Hassam blinked. Once. Twice. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand gripped the doorframe as if grounding himself, as if convincing himself this wasn't a dream. Then, finally, his voice, weak, trembling, broke the silence. "Is it really you?" Salah nodded, his lips pressing together to keep the emotion from spilling out. Hassam let out a shaky breath, his fingers twitching, as if afraid to reach out. "I thought..." His voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "I thought you forgot me." That was it. That was all it took. Salah stepped forward and wrapped his arms around the man who had shaped his entire life. The man who had once told him he was meant for greatness, who had pushed him beyond limits no one else believed he could reach. The embrace was firm, yet fragile. Hossam's body shook against him, and Salah felt the weight of everything. The years, the struggle, the quiet suffering this man had endured alone. "I could never forget you," Salah murmured. Hossam closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. For the first time in years, he was seen. Salah sat in the dimly lit room, his gaze drifting over the walls, peeling at the edges, the ceiling spotted with damp stains. The air was thick with the scent of old books and the faint trace of tea. The home was small, too small for a man who had once commanded the attention of entire teams, who had shaped the dreams of boys who had gone on to achieve everything. Everything except remembering him. Coach Hossam moved slowly, lowering himself into the worn-out armchair across from Salah. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for a cup of tea, the steam curling into the air. Salah watched him, studying the deep lines on his face, the frailty in his movements. "You've done well," Hossam finally said, his voice low but steady. "I've seen you play. I always knew you'd go far." Salah smiled faintly, but the warmth in his chest was overshadowed by something heavier. "I should have come sooner," he admitted. Hossam shook his head. "No, son. Life moves forward. That's how it's meant to be." He exhaled, staring into the tea in his hands. "But life also has a way of forgetting people like me." Salah leaned forward. "What happened?" The old man's lips pressed together for a moment before he spoke. "The club let me go years ago. Budget cuts, they said." He let out a humorless chuckle. "They promised a pension. It never came. Promised help. That never came either." He gestured around the room. "This is what's left." Salah's stomach twisted. He had played in some of the richest stadiums in the world, had seen the millions poured into football, into its players, its managers, its endorsements, and yet, the man who had given everything to the sport, who had built players, was left with nothing. "But I don't regret it," Hossam continued, watching Salah closely. "I lived my purpose. I trained good boys, made them better men. That was enough for me." Salah swallowed hard. The words were noble, strong, but not enough. Not for a man who had shaped greatness and been abandoned by it. He clenched his jaw, a quiet fire burning behind his eyes. Hossam had given him everything. And now, Salah was going to return the favor. Salah sat in the silence of his hotel room, his mind racing. He had spent hours with Hossam, listening to every word, every detail of the years of struggle, the broken promises, the slow fade into obscurity. It haunted him. The image of his coach, once larger than life, now worn down by time and hardship, would not leave his mind. Throwing money at the problem wasn't enough. Hossam deserved more than a quiet retirement and a check with Salah's name on it. He deserved to be remembered, to be honored, to be seen. Salah reached for his phone. The first call was to a close friend, someone with influence in Egyptian football. "I need you to help me with something." "No, not for me. For someone more important." The next call was to a journalist he trusted. "I have a story for you, but it's not about me." The third was to a businessman who had been wanting to collaborate with him for years. "You wanted to do something meaningful in football? I have the perfect idea." By the time the sun rose, Salah had laid the foundation of something bigger than charity, something permanent. Within days, plans were drawn up. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Calls were made to officials who had long since forgotten Coach Hossam's name, but suddenly found themselves scrambling to make amends. Then, one final detail. Salah's team made an announcement. A press conference was set, but it wasn't for him. This wasn't about his goals, his career, or his accolades. It was about the man who had stood in the scorching sun, teaching a young boy how to dream. And when the world heard what was coming, they were left speechless. The sun hung low over Cairo, casting golden light over the stadium. The air buzzed with anticipation, murmurs rippling through the crowd as people filled the seats. Journalists adjusted their cameras, former players exchanged glances, and football officials whispered among themselves. No one knew exactly why they were here, only that Mohamed Salah had called them. And when Salah called, people listened. Backstage, hidden from view, Coach Hossam shifted uncomfortably in his worn blazer, his fingers gripping the edges of his chair. He had no idea why Salah had insisted on bringing him here today. He had never been one for attention. He had spent his life on the sidelines, pushing others into the spotlight. He was content with that. Salah, standing beside him, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Just trust me," he said with a small smile. A moment later, the speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today." The announcer's voice boomed through the stadium. "Tonight, we celebrate someone who has shaped Egyptian football. Not with goals, not with trophies, but with the hearts and minds he built along the way." The screen above the field flickered, and suddenly old, grainy footage played. Young boys on a dusty field, running drills under the sharp voice of a coach. A much younger Hassam stood in the center, clapping, shouting instructions, his passion for the game written in every movement. The murmurs in the stadium grew louder. Some former players gasped, recognition dawning. Then the announcer spoke again. "Tonight, we honor a man whose impact has gone unseen for far too long. A man who has given everything to football, and never asked for anything in return." The screen faded to black. "Please welcome Coach Hassam." Salah gently took his coach's arm, guiding him forward as the stadium erupted. The chant started small, then spread like wildfire. "Hassam, Hassam, Hassam!" The old man froze. His breath hitched. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, former players, football officials, journalists, fans. People who had long since forgotten him. People who had once moved on without a second thought. And now they were on their feet, cheering his name. Salah leaned in. "They remember now." Hossam's lips parted, but no words came, only tears welling in his tired eyes. Salah took the microphone. "This man," he said, voice steady, "is the reason I am here today. The reason so many of us are here today." He turned to face his coach. "And from this day forward, no coach like him will ever be forgotten again." The screen changed once more, revealing the final surprise. A foundation. The Hassam Football Academy, fully funded, designed to train and support young players and struggling coaches. His name would live on. His legacy would never be erased again. Hassam covered his mouth, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, he wasn't a man the world had forgotten. He was a legend. The press conference was meant to be routine. A few words from Salah, a polite thank you to the guests, a handshake with Coach Hassam, and that would be it. But the moment Salah stepped up to the microphone, cameras flashing, recorders held high, something shifted. The stadium was still buzzing from the tribute, the echoes of Hassam's name still lingering in the air. Reporters jostled for position, eager to get the first question in. One finally spoke, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Mohamed, this was an incredible gesture. But why? Why go to such great lengths for a man most of the world had forgotten?" Salah's jaw tensed. He hadn't prepared a speech. He didn't need to. He turned, glancing at the man sitting beside him. Hassam was still dazed, his fingers gripping the edges of the chair as if afraid this might all disappear. His old, tired eyes glistened with emotion. Salah looked back at the cameras. The answer was simple. "Because without him," he said, voice steady, "I am nothing." Silence. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The reporters, so used to rehearsed lines and calculated statements, didn't know what to say. There was no PR spin here, no scripted humility, just raw, unfiltered gratitude. Salah continued. "He believed in me before anyone else. When I was just a boy with nothing but a dream, he gave me more than training. He gave me discipline. He gave me purpose. He gave me a chance." He paused, exhaling. "And when the world forgot him, I couldn't." A single clap broke the silence. Then another. Then the entire room was on its feet. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, millions had seen it. Millions had heard those words. "Because without him, I am nothing." It wasn't just about Salah anymore. It was about every coach, every mentor, every teacher who had built someone great only to be left behind. And suddenly, gratitude was more than just a feeling. It was a movement. The stadium lights burned bright against the Cairo night, but for Mohamed Salah, the world around him felt quiet. The ceremony had ended. The press had their story. The cameras had captured every tear, every cheer, every moment. And yet, none of that mattered to him as much as the hand gripping his own. Coach Hassam's fingers, rough and calloused from years of training boys into men, trembled slightly as he held on. He looked up at Salah, his eyes filled with something more powerful than gratitude. Pride. "I always knew you'd be great," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "But today you are legendary." Salah exhaled, his chest tightening in a way no championship win had ever made him feel. He had lifted trophies, scored impossible goals, heard his name chanted by thousands. But this moment, this look in his mentor's eyes, felt like the greatest victory of all. Hassam's grip loosened, but Salah didn't let go. Not yet. "Your name will never be forgotten again," he promised. The old man smiled, shaking his head softly. "It's not my name that matters, son. It's what you've done with yours." As Salah walked away from the stadium, the weight of what had just happened settled in. The world had watched tonight. Not just football fans, not just Egyptians, but people from every corner of the globe. They had seen something more than a tribute. They had seen a lesson. The story spread, carried by headlines, retweeted by legends, shared across continents. Greatness isn't just about the goals you score, but the lives you lift along the way. That night, millions of people looked back at their own journeys, at the forgotten hands that had guided them. And for the first time in a long time, they remembered to say thank you.